The third one is this. This project also involved the establishment of false religion. False religion. But of course, if we're going to build this unified city and civilization, we do need some kind of religious element to address the spiritual side of our humanity. Something to serve as a kind of spiritual tonic, to provide a kind of unifying religious identity to go along with all the rest. And that's where the tower comes in. Let us build a tower whose top really is in italics there, literally, whose top is the heavens. Into the heavens. Whose top connects to the heavens. It's most likely this tower had a religious function. We know from archaeology that later this kind of tower became very common in Mesopotamian religion. There have been discovered in the region numbers of religious towers made out of baked brick and pitch, what are called ziggurats, not cigarettes, but ziggurats. A ziggurat was a tower with a large rectangular or square base, and then it rose up, in theory, as a kind of ladder by which the gods could descend and ascend and make connection with men. And there was usually a temple at the base, and on the top there was a small shrine for the gods. It was a kind of stairway to heaven, a stairway to the gods. It's very likely that the Tower of Babel was the original from which these ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats were modeled and developed. And we also know astrology and other ancient mystery religions find their source in Babylon, and from Babylon they spread over the whole earth. In fact, later we find in the Bible that Babylon becomes a symbol in Scripture for human civilization in rebellion against God and including false religion. For example, Revelation 17:5, we read of Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So there is this religious element to this whole project, an attempt to bring God down to their level, to domesticate God within the confines of their own man-made forms of religion. It was a form of idolatry. And then when it comes to what was wrong with all this, there's one other thing. Fourthly, there's this whole matter of centralization. It's a hard word to say for me. Centralization. And this is one of the concerns. The reason I say this is a major concern is because this is one of the concerns that God himself expresses in the text. Verse 6. And the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Now what is God saying here? Is he saying, I'm afraid if I let this go on, these people will become so powerful that they'll be more powerful than me? No, of course not. That's not the idea. The problem is the centralization of evil that this would result in it. Think about it. All the wickedness and misery that this would bring upon the earth. And God's concern for man's good, that's the issue here. Think of this. Think of concentrated, centralized sinners like a mass of people with a deadly infectious disease. And they're all crammed into one building, infecting one another, so that all this wretchedness and misery is intensified. That's the concern. If man in his rebellion and his arrogance is allowed to be centralized like this, all speaking the same language, and all together, there's no end to what man will do. That's the idea here. You may have heard the saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. Well, that's the idea here. The uniting of all people, all speaking the same language, all under the same government, is a situation that lacks the checks and balances that are necessary in this fallen world to restrain the evil of man's heart. For example, many of the freedoms that we enjoy today and that European countries enjoy today are due to the fact that when Hitler wanted to rule the world, other nations stopped him. What would it be like to have the whole world or even just the entire Western world under the rule of Nazism. The reason Bolshevistic communism, the reason it was unable to take over the world, is because there were other nations opposed to communism who resisted it and fought against it. You see, every nation has its own unique culture, its own unique language, and its own political self-interests. And these competing self-interests, even self-interests that may indeed be selfish, maybe even sinful, yet God uses these competing self-interests as a means by which unrestrained evil is kept at bay. Bringing it down to our own day, for example, was reading someone who made this comment. He said, God's division of the world into different languages hinders the rise of a global monolithic anti-Christian state that would have the power to simply wipe out all Christians. We humans are far too evil to be allowed to unite in one language or one government. So listen, my dear friends, world unity apart from God would be a curse, not a blessing. It would be a disaster. Now, there is a world unity of the right kind that Christ himself will one day bring to pass by the gospel. Even now, he is creating a people from every kindred, tribe, nation, and tongue who are being saved and incorporated into the one spiritual body, his church. And that was symbolized on the day of Pentecost. What was that all about? Everyone understanding one another and everybody speaking the same language when the Spirit was poured out. It was a picture of the reversal of what happened at the Tower of Babel and of what the ultimate end would be of the gospel, that there is coming a day when there will be a true unity. A unity of God's people in union with Christ from all nations and tribes of the world. But until then, for mankind in its arrogant self-sufficiency and false religions to be united as one, that would be a curse, not a blessing. So you see, the dividing of the nations, the confusing of languages, it was an act of grace on God's part. It was an act of judgment upon mankind from one angle, but at the same time it was also an act of common grace and kindness in order to restrain unilateral evil in the world. And also, by the way, to preserve the promise of the coming one who would crush the serpent's head. God is committed to preserving that promise throughout redemptive history. So that's the first main division in this passage. We have the grandiose schemes of man. What they determined to do, why they desired to do it, what was wrong with it. But now let's consider more briefly the sovereign intervention of God. Now I've been referring to it. God doesn't let it happen. He puts a stop to man's high-flying, arrogant pretensions and schemes. And he always does that. He always does. Or he will eventually will. Now notice the way this is laid out in the text. First we have divine investigation. There's a lot of Hebrew artistry